Welcome, everybody. I'm going to wait another minute or so before I uh, begin the formal part of our meeting today. But I was telling Ava before people started getting on that we didn't know that when we originally scheduled this, when Wayne and I sketched out the plan, the reading schedule for this series on Great Expectations, that this was going to put us on Memorial Day weekend for the final discussion, the final meeting. So uh, I I don't know how that will affect our attendance, whether it will increase or decrease the attendance, but everyone who is here is welcome. I thank you for coming. And this is our final session on Great Expectations. Uh, it's um, it's been a good run. I want to thank Wayne, who kicked us off and took another uh, session later in the series, and Catherine Springer and Clark Cloyd and David Brownell and everyone who served as a discussion leader. And I've been attending in the background and just chipping in to help move things along, but this is my turn to be a discussion leader. And our reading assignment is the end of Great Expectations. And the chapters that we'll be talking about are chapters. I actually went back one chapter uh, to include chapter 53, but it's chapters 53 to the end of the novel, which is chapter 59. Um, or if you're in the reading it in the three book format, it's book 3, chapters 14 through 20. And I wanted to say a few things about the form of Great Expectations because you probably know these things, uh, but I just wanted to remind you a little bit about them. That Great Expectations is a little bit unusual in the Dickens canon because it was published serially in weekly installments instead of monthly installments. And the usual format for that Dickens is best known for, and that other most of the other novels adopt, is the monthly installment with 20 parts, a double number, 19 and 20 together for the last part. And each installment, except for that double number at the end, was exactly 32 pages long. And Great Expectations is a shorter novel. That's one of the reasons why I think it is sometimes more familiar to people. It's not one of the 850-page novels. It's only 600 pages, or depending on which edition you're reading it in. And the chapters are also shorter. Uh, in the monthly installments, they're usually 3 or sometimes 4 chapters per installment. And with Great Expectations, there are never any more than 2 chapters in an installment. And the chapters themselves are short. But Dickens was still thinking about the shape of the novel, about the form of the novel. And you will have noticed that it is divided into 3 books. And that format was one that was familiar to Victorian readers because many of the novels that were published by standard publishers were published in 3 volumes. And one reason for the 3-volume format was the lending libraries, because it meant that you could go to the lending library. You didn't have to purchase the book, which was rather expensive. And you could read volume 1 and then go back and check out volume 2, or pass volume 1 along to your sister or somebody else in the household. and let them read that while you were reading volume 2, and so on. But with Great Expectations, it appeared as weekly installments in Dickens's magazine, his weekly magazine, the second of the 2 magazines that he edited all the year round. And the novel that had appeared immediately prior to Great Expectations was not a particularly successful one. It was the sales figures had gone down. So Dickens, and it was not a Dickens novel. It was by his fellow novelist Lever. I'm forgetting the title of that novel, but anyway, Dickens was concerned that the sales had gone down, and so he knew that the way to make the sales go back up was to publish a novel by himself. So he undertook to write Great Expectations, but he was thinking still in terms of a fixed form. And the 3-book format is evidence that he was thinking of this novel as having a particular shape. And one of the things that you may not have thought about, that an effect that is produced, is that Great Expectations, as you know, is narrated entirely by Pip. But there are a few places where Pip does not speak that are in the text. The first, of course, is the title, Great Expectations. Pip does not, who is it who writes Great Expectations at the front? It's Dickens. His name is attached. And then there are 3 other places that are similar, that belong to what the technical term for it is the paratext. That is something that is alongside the text, but that is not inside the text. And the first of those examples, and the one that sets the form for it, is at the end of chapter 19, where you read in all capital letters, "This is the end of the first stage of Pip's expectations." So that's a third person voice that is writing. And then at the end of chapter 39, this is the end of the third stage of Pip's expectations. And then at the end of chapter 59, in all caps, the end. So we are talking about the end of Great Expectations, the last stage of Pip's expectations. And that word stage, of course, implies a journey, a stagecoach journey, perhaps, but also a stage in a process, a stage in Pip's growth, a stage in Pip's expectations, and the realization or the conclusion, the culmination of Pip's expectations. But there's another meaning that I want to suggest for the title of this novel, and it's our expectations, the reader's expectations. And to think about our expectations, I think, means necessarily that we read this novel wondering how it's going to end. And if we're modern readers, we know how many pages there are in the Penguin edition, or the Oxford edition, or whichever one we're reading. And we could, even if we wanted to cheat, we could flip ahead to the end of the novel and read ahead. And I've known people who did that. I confess I have sometimes done it myself. But the 19th century reader could not read ahead. The original readers of Great Expectations had to live with their own expectation. And their expectation, I would suggest, is always the expectation of the ending. How is this book going to end? And the common term for that is suspense. And Great Expectations is a novel that builds on the technique of suspense. And suspense is the anticipation that what we have been reading up to this point is going to find an appropriate ending. So I want us to think a little bit about what an ending is. And an ending has to be appropriate to the beginning and the middle and everything that has come before. So as we read, remember we're reading, or we're pretending to read as 19th century readers of a serial installment. We don't know how many installments there will be or where the novel will end. So as we think about the ending of Great Expectations, and that's always a crucial question in this novel, in ways that um, you know the ending is always a big question in a Dickens novel, in any novel. But Great Expectations is famous for having, well, more than one ending. Um, and the usual way of talking about the ending of Great Expectations is that there are two endings. There's an ending in which Pip uh, uh, meets Estella uh, in London, um, and he's with little Pip, and she thinks that he has married, and she has remarried after the disaster of her first marriage to Drummle, and they go their separate ways. And that's sometimes called the unhappy ending. And then the other ending, at least if you think in terms of uh, two endings for Great Expectations, is one that ends with Pip and Estella meeting each other in the ruined garden at Satis House after 11 years apart. And they see each other and they speak and they exchange words. And then Pip writes a final paragraph, which is sometimes thought of as the happy ending to Great Expectations. But you know how scholars are. Scholars are not happy with letting there be only two endings. And they have gone back and they have looked at the original manuscript of the novel. And there's a rather famous essay by a great Dickensian that is called The Six Endings of Great Expectations. And other people talk about the three endings of Great Expectations. And we'll come back to that. But I want you to just keep in mind two things that I've been saying about ending. One is the uncertainty of the Victorian reader about what the ending will be and what will be necessary to have a proper ending. And that suspense about knowing what will be a satisfactory ending. And then the other thing I want you to keep in mind is that we as readers will construct our own ending to this novel, and that the ending is something that is not a single chapter or a single sentence, but a series of chapters. So when we think about the ending to Great Expectations, we should think about multiple endings, and that each chapter or each installment of the weekly serialization is potentially an ending. So as we think about endings, both as Victorians and as moderns, We know that Great Expectations has a first part, a first stage of Pip's expectations, and a second stage. And since 3 is kind of a number that has um, completion built into it, we think that there will be 3 stages to Pip's expectations. Um, and what has to happen in order to end a novel that is built around expectations, readers' expectations, as well as Pip's expectations? So there needs to be, I would suggest, a final meeting between Pip, who's the central character and the narrator, between Pip and most, or if not all, of the major and even some of the minor characters in the novel. So certainly a final meeting with Miss Havisham is part of an ending. And I would suggest that we have already read and talked about the ending with Miss Havisham, which is when Miss Havisham catches fire and Pip uses his cloak and burns his hands in order to put the fire out. But we know as readers that that's not really the ending of the novel. And we know in several ways because there are other final meetings that have to take place. We know that there has to be a final meeting between Pip and Magwitch, for example. So the meeting with Miss Havisham is not a final ending. There are other, and we need to have an ending to the escape plot because Magwitch has returned and Pip wants to get him out of England um, for his own motives as well as generous motives with respect to Magwitch, because Magwitch, as a returned convict, um, is at risk of being executed if it is discovered that he has returned from his transportation in Australia. So the escape plot needs to have an ending. And indeed, we do have an ending of the escape plot. But if the escape plot is not a complete ending, Pip burns his hands. And when we read the Miss Havisham fire, we say, why does Pip burn his hands? Why is it necessary to the story that Pip should burn his hands? Well, we wonder about that, and we learn that it has its own little plot reason, which is that it means that Pip can't row the boat. And why is it important that Pip can't row the boat? Because it means that he will be sitting with Magwitch and talking to Magwitch on the river. And the scenes in chapter 54, which is the escape chapter, the escape is one of the I think one of the finest chapters in this book. So Ava, why don't you put up the first slide that I have prepared, because this is the chapters 53 to 59, or in the 3-volume, 3-book format chapters, book 3, chapters 14 to 20. So I'll go just quickly to remind you of the sections that we're talking about. So chapter 53, we already discussed a little bit last time. Orlick and Pip is summoned back to the lime kiln. He's rescued by Herbert and Trabb's boy. And I would suggest that Trabb's boy is part of the ending of the novel, that Trabb's boy is one of those minor characters in the novel that Dickens wants to bring back. And so you have a comic character from earlier in the book who's going to reappear here. And there's one thing about this chapter, I'm not going to talk very much about this chapter, but that is a little bit funny that I wanted to ask people about. Pip gets a letter that summons him to the lime kiln. And I think there's something odd about that letter. Does anyone have any thoughts about why that letter is odd, why it's unusual? If you do, raise your hand, hand function. It's something about the letter itself, not the content of the letter, but about the way that the letter is written. Who writes the letter is the leading question.
Maybe Campinson writes it down.
That's the thing I was looking for, because Orlick, we hear Orlick speak in that scene, and we've heard him speak before, but Orlick speaks in working class dialect. Orlick is incapable, I would suggest, of writing that letter in the very polite and correct English. So Orlick has plotted with Compeyson. Compeyson, as Orlick tells us, writes 20 hands. Orlick is a forger, someone who is literate and who can write a polite and correct letter. So it's a hint that Orlick and Compeyson are in cahoots. They're collaborating, and that Orlick is the tool or the accomplice of Compeyson. And that repeats what we know about Compeyson and Magwitch, that Compeyson was the gentleman, the upper class criminal who used a working class person character to do the dirty work for his the crime that he was committing. Then chapter 54 is the escape chapter. I think a wonderful chapter. The preparation for it is described in detail, the attempt and the capture. And this is an ending chapter of sorts. We could say that that chapter 54 is an ending. How is it an ending? Well, it's a plot moment that has been prepared for, elaborately, and we find out what happens. There is no escape, and Magwitch is put in prison. But it has wonderful moments in it. The scenes between Magwitch and Pip on the river have often been suggested as something that influenced Mark Twain in Huckleberry Finn, and that the scenes where Pip and Magwitch have conversation, and Magwitch is at peace. Pip is very anxious, worried about being overtaken, about whether the escape will succeed, but Magwitch is not anxious at all. And that composure that he has is like the moments, the pastoral moments, they're sometimes called in Huckleberry Finn, where Huck and Jim are on the river, and before they have what turns out to be a capture as well. Then chapter 55 and chapter 56 are an installment. Chapter 53 is an installment by itself. Chapter 54 is an installment by itself. Chapters 55 and 56 go together as an installment. So in chapter 55, Magwitch is in prison. We learn some things about Herbert. We get that we know that Herbert announces his intention to marry Clara, and Wemmick marries Miss Skiffins in a comic scene, and Herbert leaves for Cairo, leaves for Egypt, using the money that Pip has arranged to give to him. And Pip is left in London, and he says specifically that now that Herbert has left him, that he's in their apartment, their flat in London, but he has no home. And we've talked about home and the various homes in the novel. And then the companion chapter to that is Pip's final visit with Magwitch in prison, where he tells him about what he knows about Estella, and they have an important conversation. So this is another, if you will, another scene of closure, the scene between Pip and Magwitch. And there's lots of important stuff that happens in that chapter. Then chapter 57 is an installment by itself. And we learn a number of things about the plot, that Pip has been living above his means. He no longer has the money from Magwitch. He's seized for debt and threatened with imprisonment himself. He falls ill. He has hallucination. And then Joe appears. So a scene with Joe is necessary to a conclusion. He takes care of Pip. He pays Pip's debts. He tells Pip the story about Orlick's attack on Pumblechook. So we have a little bit of Pumblechook reappearance, though it's at second hand. And Pip announces at the end of that chapter that he plans to marry Biddy. So chapter 58 and chapter 59 are the final installment of the novel. And Pip returns to the village, meets Pumblechook, finds out that Biddy and Joe are married, asks them for forgiveness, departs to join Herbert in Egypt, and tells us a little bit about his situation in Cairo, in Clarriker's business, and sums it up by saying, we were not in a grand way of business, but we had a good name and worked for our profits and did very well. And then chapter 59, the second part of that concluding installment, is the one in which Pip returns to Satis house and meets Estella. So my point in saying all of this is that the ending of Great Expectations is really a series of endings. It's a series of scenes that are necessary to the completion of the story and to a resolution of many of the subplots or partial plots, including some of the comic plots of the novel. And I think it's important that we remember that Dickens is a great comic novelist, and that Great Expectations has a lot of comic passages in it, and that the ending of Great Expectations, these several endings that I've been pointing out, are all have elements of comedy in them. Trabb's boy, Wemmick's marriage to Miss Skiffins among them, Pumblechook's reappearance. I think Pumblechook is one of the, he's both a villain in the novel, but he's a comic villain. He's not like Compeyson. He's the false benefactor, and he deserves to get punished. And he gets punished the first time when Pip puts the emetic in the brandy bottle that Pumblechook drinks. And he gets punished again by Orlick in chapter 57. And then we have even one more scene where Pumblechook comes back in chapter 58. So comedy is part of the ending of Great Expectations. So I say this because I want us to talk about the ending of Great Expectations, and in particular to talk about, well, the final installment of of uh, of the novel. And my other suggestion is that endings are always something that exist in the mind of the reader, and that readers will remember different things. We have different expectations about how a book should end, and then the book gives us an ending or several endings that we can read as its endings. And I wanted to show you, so endings are subject to interpretation. And Great Expectations famously is a novel that has many adaptations, film adaptations in particular. And I've asked Ava to prepare for us probably the most famous of the film versions of Great Expectations, which is the one by David Lean in the 1947 film version of Great Expectations. So I'm going to ask Ava to show this, and then I'll open the floor for discussion of endings and the final ending or its versions in Great Expectations. So, Ava.
Are you able to see this okay?
Can everyone see it? Okay. So it's silent at the beginning. Pip is remembering his first visits to Addis House.
Name?
Humble soup.
Quite right. Come in, Pip.
I know nothing of days of the week, nothing of weeks of the year.
Don't loiter, boy. Come along, boy. Put your hat on.
Whom have we here?
A boy.
Boy of the neighborhood, eh?
But he is a common laboring boy.
You can break his heart.
This door, boy.
Estella. Estella, what are you doing here? I thought you were in Paris with your husband.
I have no husband, Pip. Have you not heard?
I've been ill, Estella. I've heard nothing.
When Mr. Jaggers disclosed to Bentley Drummle my true parentage, he no longer wished to have me for a wife. Well, Pip, why don't you laugh? You've every right to.
I've no wish to laugh, Estella. I'm truly sorry.
You've no need to pity me. It has simplified my life. There's now no need to sell the house. It is mine, and I shall live here. I shall like it here, Pip. Away from the world and all its complications.
Estella, how long have you been here?
I don't know.
Estella, you must leave this house. It's a dead house. Nothing can live here. Leave it, Estella, I beg of you. What do you mean? This is the house where I grew up. It's part of me. It's my home. It's Miss Havisham's home. But she's gone, Estella. Gone from this house, from you, from both of us. She is not gone. She is still here with me in this house. In this very room. Then I defy her. I have come back, Miss Havisham. I have come back to let in the sunlight. Look, Estella, look. Nothing but dust and decay. I've never ceased to love you, even when there seemed no hope for my love. You're part of my existence, part of myself. Estella, come with me, out into the sunlight. Look at me. Pip, I'm afraid. Look at me. We belong to each other. Let's start again. Together.
Okay, that's enough. Thanks, Ava. So I leave the floor open for comments about the David Lean version, the Charles Dickens version of the ending, the many endings of Great Expectations, and your ending of Great Expectations.
Well, I think this is pretty much a cheesy Hollywood ending. I don't like it at all. And I'm not sure, does Estella know her true parentage in the novel? At the end, does she know her parentage? I don't think so.
It certainly is not revealed to us, and Pip has not seen her since he discovered that information. So so one way to read this is, yes, it's a cheesy Hollywood version. Does it have any justification in the novel?
I don't think so.
Martha, raise your hands if you want to speak. So Martha. And unmute. Can't hear you.
Caroline also has her hand raised.
As I recall, in the novel, he says to Estella, I know, no, he says it to, I think he says it to Estella. No, I guess I'm confusing. He tells Magwitch that he knows.
Yes.
But doesn't he also say something to Estella?
No.
So no? Okay, all right. I would like to say that my impression this time is very different from other times I've read the book. And I think his sentence about we should be together, I don't know that necessarily means physically together. I think he just is saying that he will remember her forever. But he's going on to Cairo, and I don't think they would end up together.
Okay. And we have to look at what he actually says to her and what he says about what she says to him, and then what he says about the two of them at the end. So, Dorothy.
Jaggers says to Pip, what good would it do to tell any of them, either Estella's mother, Magwitch, or Estella herself, anything about her origin? That it would be devastating to her.
And that is Jaggers' advice. And Jaggers, as we know, he's a professional, and he has very precise ideas about what should and should happen. And Pip doesn't always agree with Jaggers. So it still leaves open the possibility that he might do something other than what Jaggers suggests. But that's one piece of evidence. Yes. So, Carolyn.
Well, I remember the movie with great fondness, and it is dated, but it was of its time. It really was beautifully photographed. The only thing that struck me is I think John Mills was well cast, strong, but kind of, bit of a weakling. But I really didn't like Valerie Hobson. I mean, I didn't care for her casting. And it's interesting, the young Estella was played by Jean Simmons, who was a beautiful young actress. And they made subsequent movies, and she played Miss Havisham in one of the later movies. Yeah, I didn't care for Estella. I think it was a beautiful movie. It is dated, but what was it, 1949?
It's 47, maybe made in 46, released in 47, I think are the dates. And the date of the film is I think also relevant. Yes, they recast Jean Simmons as Miss Havisham in a later version. I don't know all of the film versions. We're going to show some of them this summer at the Dickens Universe. And so one of the things inevitably that we're going to need to talk about is the different film versions of the ending. But Virginia.
Yes, I was going to say, I think it's interesting. Dickens, showed his first ending to a friend who didn't like the idea that there was no hope for them ever getting back together. And then he wrote the second ending. And I think Hollywood wanted to do the exact same thing, that as they looked, Hollywood, they would prefer a really happy ending. It's like the director that made Anna Karenina, the producer, he hadn't read the book. And when it ended with her jumping from the train, he goes, "We can't have that. That's ridiculous." And he had to redo it. They made them redo the ending. But I think Hollywood wanted to tie up the loose ends in the same way Dickens did, but to have them be together, and for her to get out of what she'd done. It was interesting that, her husband didn't die, and they didn't really bring up how horrible he was. But they allowed him to be gone so that they could be together. And I think it's okay that Hollywood wanted to try to have a happier ending than Dickens' original ending, just as his friend told him that the original ending was not very happy and he should try something different.
Okay, that you're right to remind us that it was on the advice of his friend, the novelist Edward Bulwer Lytton, that Dickens decided to rework the ending. And I was trying to suggest that Dickens thought very carefully about the form of his novel, and thought, its division into 3 books. The number of chapters is the same in each book. Dickens's craft as a novelist is very much a part of this, and he reworked that ending, and even the language of the final sentence in the novel is something that scholars have debated. And if we compare the versions that we have among the people at this meeting, we will see that there are probably different versions of that final sentence in the versions that we have. So, Carl, did you have your hand up earlier? Yes. Why don't not? Ava caught your hand raised. So, Carl.
Yes, thanks. The David Lean movie is even more positive than the Dickens second ending. It's very clear to me that they're going to live happily ever after because they go hand in hand out through the gate. But my feeling after, this is one of my favorite books and my favorite Dickens. My feeling is that the original ending is more apt to the rest of the book. I don't like the second ending that implies that they're going to get together again. I think the first ending, which says that they've both learned and had a difficult time, but have come to accept it or live with it, is much more in keeping with the book than the happier ending.
If the revised version is a happier ending. So, and there's some debate about that. But yes, okay. Other comments, Blair and then Wayne.
Yeah, I too like the first ending. I have to keep my comments pretty much to myself here at home. My wife is a very successful writer. She's in most libraries. Just look up Amy Hill Hearth and you'll see her there. And I've been through 11 of her books. And I've been through the endings of 11 of her books. And what I found is I should just keep my mouth shut and watch as she dithers from one ending to the next to the next. And I share the conviction that a lot of people have that Dickens did not write in a vacuum and paid attention to the public. We all know the strong reaction that the public had to his ending of the old curiosity shop when he killed off Nell. So anyway, that's just, my opinions are worth nothing, but there you are.
Okay. We have a couple of votes for the most unhappy of the endings. That is the original one. So thank you for that, and we would be interested at perhaps some other time to know your wife's opinion about the ending controversy in Great Expectations. So Wayne.
Let's see. I'm unmuted, I guess.
Yes, you're
okay. I just wanted to say I really like what David Lean did with the Gothic feature, because there's a strong Gothic strain in the novel. So to take Estella back to the evil great house and invoke the continuing evil influence of Miss Havisham, I think are very effective. The other point I have about the David Lean movie, someone has mentioned this. Absolutely, Hollywood and even British filmmakers too have to think about box office. And if the movie ends really sadly, box office will crash. That's a well-established financial fact. So that something like that may have been in Dickens' mind when he wrote the second ending, to offer a little more mild, I think, impression at the very end.
Yes, and thank you for that. And Dickens was always concerned with box office, if we can use that term anachronistically. That is, he kept his eye on the sales. And one thing that is often alleged is that when the sales of Martin Chuzzlewit began to fail, that Dickens said, okay, I'll send my characters off to America. And then the sales went up again. So Dickens kept his eye and his hand on the success of his sales and made adjustments in the course of writing. So that could be one of the factors. But Dickens was also an artist and cared about the integrity of his art. And so I don't want to slight that dimension of his craft and say that it was only for box office. Hollywood, the demands of a film being made in 1946, those are other considerations that perhaps need to be taken into account. So, Glenna.
Yes, excuse me. I wanted to say, first of all, I like the second ending because I think there's enough ambiguity in it that it's not a done deal that this is going to have any kind of happy ending. And I love that you led us through how there are multiple endings, because that led me to reflect just now for the first time that I had this particular thought. This has a marriage plot, sort of, but to me, it's not primarily a marriage plot novel. It's a novel about various of the characters' moral trajectories. And it's so moving when Pip begins to really have the capacity to empathize and love Magwitch. And Magwitch has, in his care for his boy, his dear boy, he redeems himself morally from a life of crime. In the David Lean movie, if Estella hasn't suffered, Estella's character, I would imagine, in the Dickens version, where she has been married to a brute, even the brutalization has awakened her moral sensitivities, her capacity to feel. So each of these three characters has a really significant moral trajectory, and hence the multiple endings where we get some sense of how each of these three characters grows morally. To me, it's interesting. The last time I reread the novel, all I could think of was, this is about dirty money, and it's a critique of capitalism. And this time when I reread it, it was just, I was so moved by Pip's moral trajectory. And that's enough for me.
Okay. Very interesting comments. And in the history of adaptations of Great Expectations, film and theatrical, the question of what the main plot is something that people discuss. And we could say that the moral development of not just the central character, Pip, but the moral development of relationships between people in the novel is one of the central themes. And you could even say that this is a novel that, I'm embarrassed by the term, that flirts with the marriage plot, that says that could be the central plot of this novel. But no, the central story of this novel is the story of male friendships. That is the relationship between Pip and the central male characters in the novel, and even some of the minor characters in the novel, that it's relationships between men, the relationship between Pip and Joe, the relationship between Pip and Magwitch, the relationship between Pip and Herbert, even in a comic vein, the relationship between Pip and Wemmick, that it's, and also that it's a novel about fathers, that Pip is a character who has no parents. He's an orphan and is in search of and in need of parenting, and finds parents, particularly fathers, at many points in the stage of his journey. Magwitch says explicitly, "I'm your second father." Joe is kind of a brother, but also an older brother, and in that sense, I think a father figure for him. Jaggers is certainly a candidate for a father figure. Pumblechook would like to claim whenever you have an uncle in a Dickens novel, the uncle is a figure often of a positive father. In Pumblechook's case, not a positive father. So this novel teases us, is maybe a better word than flirts, but teases us with a marriage plot. And what does it give us as a culmination of marriage? It gives us Skiffins and Wemmick. That's the only marriage that takes place actually in the discourse of the novel. Herbert and Clara marry, but they do it off stage. So so I think those are very good observations. So Martha, is your hand still up? Yes, okay, go ahead. And then,
It just came to me a few minutes ago. Can you hear me?
yes.
Okay. This ending seems to me to be familiar. Those of you familiar with the ends of French movies, you never know exactly what the end is. And this seems like maybe because of his love of France and being there a lot and probably reading books from there, you know, is kind of using that technique of leaving it unclear. And, you know, that's just a comment that could be one of the reasons why he used that technique.
One thing that has sometimes been suggested about the ending to Great Expectations, particularly by people who emphasize the ambiguity and the uncertainty, and Dickens's tinkering with the actual wording of that final sentence, for example, is that it is more like the ending of a Flaubert novel, where you end on an off note. You end not in a way that wraps things up and gives you the Hollywood kind of closure to a story, but one that leaves it dangling, that leaves the story incomplete, that leaves it yet to be finished. And to be finished by whom? To be finished by us as the readers to it. And I'd like to, before calling on Tom and then David and Margaret, we have a list of people. I'd like us to look at the final sentence of the novel, because it appears, depending on whose edition you are reading, it appears in different forms, and that is because different editors have made different decisions about it. So we know the ending that Dickens rejected, the so-called unhappy ending, in which Pip and Estella go their separate ways after meeting each other in London. And that's the ending that Bulwer-Lytton advised Dickens not to use. But let me read the final paragraph of the novel. In a very old edition, so you will have different wording, slightly different wording in whatever version you are reading from, or you may. I took her hand in mine. No, we are friends, said I, rising and bending over her as she rose from the bench. And we'll continue friends apart, said Estella. I took her hand in mine, and we went out of the ruined place. And as the morning mists had risen long ago when I first left the forge, so the evening mists were rising now, and in all the broad expanse of tranquil light they showed to me, I saw no shadow of another parting from her. So if you're reading Penguin, or if you're reading Oxford, or another modern version, you will have a different version of that final sentence. You will have a sentence that reads, I saw the shadow of no parting from her. So the version that I read was, I saw no shadow of another parting from her. Oxford and Penguin use, going back to the manuscript, I saw the shadow of no parting from her. And there is another manuscript version that Dickens rejected. I saw a shadow, excuse me, I saw no shadow of a parting from her but one. So that's at least 3 versions of Dickens, who is, I suggest, a very careful and thoughtful writer, working that last sentence and working it, and editors have chosen different versions of the final sentence. So it's not just a question of choosing between 2 endings. It's a question of choosing which of several sentences is the final sentence to the novel, and what the differences might be among those versions of the final sentence. So I've interrupted probably people's train of thought, but I'll go back to the raised hands. Tom Savignano.
Yes, John, I think that all of those endings have a certain ambiguity to them. He could, I mean, if he wanted to convey that they were going to be happy, without question, he would have done that very easily. I think that when Bulwer Lytton talked him out of the first ending, and I suspect he would have printed the first ending, he decided to compromise and make it a very ambiguous ending. In other words, the business of no shadow, we're still talking about it. And I think that's what he wanted to happen. I think he wanted ambiguity right to the end. It was his way of saying, okay, if I can't have the first ending, I am going to shadow the second ending and not give you a clear solution. But I have another question, and that is the rejected ending. I have always wondered this. Pip is in Piccadilly walking and talking with young Pip. And along comes Estella in her carriage. And she assumes that young Pip is his son, and he does not contradict her. There's no statement, oh no, he's merely my nephew, or whatever you want to call him. I don't remember what he is. And I have always wondered if that ending had been published that way, would we all be wondering why he doesn't contradict her?
Those are 2 very good things, comments. The first about perhaps deliberate ambiguity as Dickens's way of ending the story, and and the second, the question about Pip's failure to disclose the full story. And I would ask, as a kind of teaser follow-up to that second comment, does Pip ever do anything similar? But I want to, before trying to answer that question, let's tuck it away and come back to it. I'm going to go on and call on people. So David and then Margaret.
I'm going to ramble a bit. I like Tom's question very much. One of the things that kept coming into my head on this rereading as things were winding up, I was interested in the change in the relationship between Pip and Magwitch. And I kept thinking of something that Dickens doesn't quote, which is the point in The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, where the mariner says he sees the things in the ocean and he says, I blessed them unawares. And that's the moment at which he begins to be freed from his act. And the change in Pip's perception of and relationship to Magwitch seems to me a real turning point. Okay, second point, rather unrelated. I was thinking in our discussion of a novel, a modern novel called The French Lieutenant's Woman by John Fowles, which is playing with the Victorian novel, and if I remember correctly, has alternate endings. Third point, I really rejected the ending of the David Lean movie. I think it's very hard to imagine Pip and Estella building a successful relationship because there is so much history between them, so many different perceptions. I can't see how they would get past that. I don't know if any of these fit together or make sense.
The John Fowles' French Lieutenant's Woman does have two endings that are part of the text. It's not a rejected ending and a substituted one. The text itself, the novel itself, has two endings, and the reader is permitted to choose which of the endings he or she prefers. And of course, the famous Broadway version of The Mystery of Edwin Drood, the unfinished novel, allows the audience to take a vote on what will happen, who committed the murder, and who will get married at the end. So this idea of two endings dating back perhaps to Great Expectations or dating back perhaps even earlier. I would argue, and this was the basis for my early comments about about what an ending is, and my implicit question, where is an ending? An ending is not always the last sentence. An ending is not always the last chapter. An ending is not always the last serial installment. An ending can be spread across the entire novel. And just if this is a kind of perverse way to think about it, what is the last thing that Pip does in Great Expectations? The last thing he does is to tell the story of Great Expectations, beginning with chapter 1. So you could argue that the ending of Great Expectations begins in chapter 1, which is written in the past tense. So that would then force us to think about the role of the narrator in telling this story. What is the narrator's growth and development in moral terms and in any other terms that you want to use for him? So there's a way in which the question of ending doubles back on itself and makes us think about storytelling, that Pip is telling the story of his entire life. And that is the ending of Great Expectations. But Margaret, go ahead.
Thanks, John. First of all, I'd like to say that in the second version of the ending, that Dickens gave Pip the ending that he wanted. And maybe that was his truest bond with his characters, that in giving Pip what he wanted, which was the hopeful union with Estella. But I raised my hand when Glenna had made her wonderful comments about the moral trajectories of the characters. And I call to mind, it's chapter 57 or the chapter 17 in book 3, with where Joe is taking care of Pip. And it is when Joe brings up the tickler and why he did not intervene satisfactorily between his wife and Pip's sister, and the tickler, which was doing such harm to Pip and his development. And my point is that Joe is given the opportunity to explain himself in all this time that he's taking care of Pip, and to, in a way, he is unveiling himself to exonerate himself and to clear his past so he can move on also. So he's a good man, as we know, but he also has the conscience. And to bring back again what Glenna said about the moral trajectory of the characters, that is a major part in Joe's development of character by Dickens. And that it also brings to mind what John Jordan said about the male relationships between Pip, which are even, perhaps you didn't say more important than the female relations, but are essential to the telling of the story, which is the male relations, and especially between Joe and Pip, because Pip has so many second thoughts about it. And on that, I'd like to jump back to Orlick at the lime kiln, where he accuses Pip of saying, "You did this, you brought about your sister's great harm and her demise. It was your fault." And we have found out in reading the book that Pip is always conscious of these terrible things that he's done, and is taking responsibility for them. And here comes Orlick to say, yes, you're the real villain. And we don't get exactly what Pip is thinking about except self-survival at that point. But I think that it's a very, very important scene or chapter in which Orlick accuses Pip of these things. And it also brings to mind of what John Jordan has written in the past about doubles in the novel. I've only read a few of the of John Jordan's comments about that over the many years, but there's that to discuss, I think, probably in your wonderful summer conference. And I'd also like to say thank you to the Pickwick Club for inviting us to this meeting. And that's about all I want to say right now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. These are useful comments, and we will not resolve anything today, I expect, but we will continue the conversation this summer when we devote the entire week of the Dickens universe to discussing this. Jonathan.
Thank you very much, Professor Jordan. I'm new to the group. Hello, everybody. I will be there this summer. I'm very excited about it. I've always been intrigued about the multiple endings of Great Expectations, and I don't know a better place to start than just looking at Dickens' own words in his letters. And if I may just take about 2 minutes, but his first discussion of the changed ending is in June 23rd, 1861, in a letter to Wilkie Collins. And he says, "As yet, I have hardly got into the enjoyment of thorough laziness. Bulwer was very anxious that I should alter the end of Great Expectations, the extreme end, I mean, after Biddy and Joe are done with, and stated his reasons so well that I have resumed the wheel and taken another turn at it. Upon the whole, I think it is for the better. You shall see the change when we meet. And the next day he wrote to Bulwer and he said, I send you the enclosed, the whole of the concluding weekly number of Great Expectations in order that you may more readily understand where I've made the change. My difficulty was to avoid doing too much. My tendency, when I began to unwind the thread that I thought I had wound forever, was to labor it and get out of proportion. So I have done it in a few words as possible, and I hope that you will like the alteration that is entirely due to you. Also to Carlyle, we'll learn. And the revised ending is 1,000 words, and the original was 300 words. It's interesting. And lastly, in a July 1st letter to Forster, John Forster was his editor and very close personal friend for decades. And one of the questions I have is, for another time, is why Dickens made the change without consulting with Forster. That's very much kind of a very unusual thing. And so he advised Forster after the fact on July 1st. He said, you will be surprised to hear that I have changed the end of Great Expectations from and after Pip's return to Joe's, and finding his little likeness there. Bulwer, who has been, as I think you know, extraordinarily taken by the book, so strongly urged it upon me after reading the proofs and supported his views with such good reasons that I resolved to make the change. You shall have it when you come back to town. I have put it in a pretty little piece of writing as I could, and I've no doubt the story will be more acceptable through the alteration. So that's fascinating to me, and I think there's a lot of sort of questions that come about it. It almost appears that Dickens is glad to have had the opportunity to make a change recommended by Bulwer. And lastly, in Forster, his own the biography of Dickens that he was his official biographer. He says, I have put it in a, Forster writes himself, this new ending, it turned out to be the case, but the first ending nevertheless seems to be more consistent with the drift, as well as natural working out of the tale. And for this reason, it is preserved in a note. So Forster kept the original. And so it seems as if Forster, he preferred the first, as I did. So I'm done. I just wanted to share that.
No, these are useful, and that word "more acceptable" in the letter seems to be consistent with the box office argument that Dickens is thinking about what his readers would prefer, a happier ending, perhaps. But I think it's also fair to say that whenever Dickens revised something, he thought his revision was better than what he had done before, because otherwise, why would you revise? So first, and then a better one, and Forster saying the first one was better or more consistent with the drift of the whole book. I mean, these are versions of precisely the argument that we are having, that the discussion that we have. And I think also that I've said this to my students on a number of occasions, that books read us as well as we read books. That is, we read into the books what we want from them. And that in that sense, they say as much about us as they do about the books themselves. But yes, so thanks for those useful letters and the comment from Forster. And Sarah. Muted.
I am more along the line of what Glenna brought up, and then Margaret continued. So for me, like Great Expectation, what is Great Expectations? How we understand it when we start, and how do we understand it when we end? And this is the end for me. One of the expectations in this book is like the childhood of Pip. Like, can a boy, and we talked about it, can a boy grow up in this childhood, and can there be a correction? Can it be healed? And I think the scene that Margaret brought is just unbelievable, because it starts by Pip wanting to tell Joe. He said, do you know who my benefactor was? And Joe says he was a guy who wrote a note. Joe doesn't say he was a convict that we traced. He said he was a guy who wrote a note, so he doesn't want to mention the convict. And then Joe explains what Margaret told us, that he couldn't really protect unconditionally. He couldn't protect Pip unconditionally, because this would have made things worse for Pip. And he explains it very well. But why, when Pip wants to tell him the entire story, Joe is stopping him. And then he says he explains to him why he couldn't protect him fully. And then he says, we have to agree, and this is Biddy's advice, to accept things as they are. And I was thinking about it a long time. Like, why is this flaw? Why does he doesn't want to hear? And it goes back to the beginning, when Pip steals and doesn't tell Joe that he stole. And he explains it. He says, my inner side wasn't yet composed as regards to Joe. He wasn't yet convinced in the unconditional love that Joe can give him. And Joe couldn't give him an unconditional love because Miss Joe was there. And he lives his life with the guilt of stealing and not telling the truth to Joe. Now, at this point, in this chapter, when he wants to tell him who the benefactor is, he has to tell him the truth from his childhood. He has to tell him that he is the one who took care of this convict. Otherwise, how can he explain that he became his benefactor? And for some reason, Joe prefers that he doesn't tell it, that he doesn't open up. And I was thinking, today we'll say, oh, tell everything, just talk, here you are, you're talking very well, you got very close. But then he also didn't want to tell him that he's getting married, because he was still sick, and he was worried that he'll get too excited and it will hurt him. So maybe at that point he was worried that it's too exciting for Pip and he better not talk about it. But if we talk about an expectation that the childhood will be repaired, I think the childhood was repaired, because at the real childhood, Joe wasn't able to give him his unconditional love. But during the illness itself is a repeat, a second chance to live the childhood. He takes care of him exactly. Everything in the childhood repeats, but this time he can give him an unconditional love. And I think this is a correction in the book. So this is one good ending for me. And as Glenna said, there are several of those. And as David said, if people would have married Estella, I would have get very worried. It won't be a happy ending for me.
A marriage counselor would be in their futures.
Yeah.
They've got a lot of history that they would need to work out. No, that's a very useful comment. And it goes back to my sense that the male relationships in this book may be more central
Yeah.
or more important. I don't know how to weight those, but certainly the relationship with Joe, Pip's ever so painful treatment of Joe, the number of times that he has gone back to the village and has not seen Joe. And it even creeps in a little bit in that wonderful chapter when Joe has taken care of him in the illness, when he begins to call Pip sir.
Yeah.
And then Pip notices that Joe has vanished without saying goodbye.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I think, I mean, this gets back to something that is very, very close to my heart. I think that scenes of goodbye are really crucial in this novel, and that the final, these sentences that we have been talking about, and the last movement is about a scene of goodbye. And I don't, that's my objection to the David Lean version, although I think it's a very fine film adaptation in many, many ways. Its version of the opening scene, the appearance of Magwitch, even just the small part that David, that you pointed out, that bringing Estella, not the scene of Pip and Estella, not in the garden, but bringing it back inside the house with Estella sitting in Miss Havisham's chair and hearing Miss Havisham's voice. And it raises the possibility that Estella is going to become another version of Miss Havisham. That's a horrible thought, and it's not what happens, but it's another possible ending that is just suggested. And your question about why am I remembering? I'm trying to remember so many things. Why Joe does not want Pip to tell the full story of who the benefactor is, for me, is related to the question that was raised earlier about Pip not telling David, I think this was your question, Pip not telling Estella in the original version that the child with him is Pip and Biddy's child, not his own child. Why does he not tell the full story? And there's one other instance of that I would like us to think about, and that's the scene between Pip and Magwitch. We've just talked now about the final scene between Pip and Joe. It's not the final, but it's an important, almost final scene between Pip and Joe. And when Pip and Magwitch are together, it's almost a deathbed scene. And it's at the end of chapter 56. And I'm going to read this. You could look at it. It's the very end of chapter 56 if you have your copy of the novel handy, but you will remember this. So, dear Magwitch, I must tell you now at last, you understand what I say. A gentle pressure on my hand. You had a child once whom you loved and lost. A stronger pressure on my hand. She lived and found powerful friends. She is living now. She is a lady and very beautiful, and I love her. With a last faint effort, which would have been powerless but for my yielding to it and assisting it, he raised my hand to his lips. Then he gently let it sink upon his breast again, with his own hands lying on it. The placid look at the white ceiling came back and passed away, and his head dropped quietly on his breast. Mindful then of what we had read together, I thought of the two men who went up into the temple to pray, and I knew there were no better words that I could say beside his bed than, "O Lord, be merciful to him, a sinner." And that's the end of that chapter. So I really am interested in your thoughts about this particular interaction, because Pip does not tell the full story to Magwitch here. He says, you had a child once whom you loved and lost. She lived and found powerful friends. She is living now. She's a lady and very beautiful, and I love her.
Mm-hmm.
But he doesn't say, and she doesn't love me back.
Mm-hmm.
Pip doesn't tell the full story. You could say, and this is not Dickens's language, that this is a kind of white lie. It's telling Magwitch something that will make Magwitch feel better and believe, perhaps, that a happy ending is possible, that Pip and Magwitch's daughter will walk off together in the sunset, hand in hand.
Yeah. So remember that Magwitch lied for him when he told everybody that he stole, so they don't suspect Pip. So the first scene between when he gives him the food and he asks him, "Does it taste good?" and Magwitch is so moved by the attention. And then he makes a point to tell everybody how he stole everything so they don't suspect Pip. Yes. So sometimes lies are positive. Lies have good intentions.
And Joe, wonderful as he is, has a simple moral belief that lies are lies. Don't tell no more of them.
Yeah.
Sometimes lies or half-truths, whatever we want to call them, may be beneficial.
Yeah.
But which ending do you prefer? Why do I not expect to get a definitive answer?
Well, I'll tell you which one, and I'll tell you why, but not quite yet. But I do want your opinion about Pip's final thoughts to himself after he tells the half-truth or the incomplete story to Magwitch. You had a child, and she's beautiful, and I love her. And then he says, mindful of what we had read together. What is it that they had read together? I thought of the two men who went up into the temple to pray, and I knew there were no better words that I could say beside his bed than, "O Lord, be merciful to him, a sinner."
They were reading scripture together.
Yes. What, does anyone know what scripture they were reading?
The two Pharisees, I think. Oh, no, one Pharisee and one poor man.
And one publican.
One, I think, underclassed person.
Yes, it's...
and the Pharisee is, I think, justifying himself before God, and the other guy, the humble guy, is saying, "Oh Lord, be merciful to me, a sinner."
Yes.
So that he changed one word to him, which is originally to me.
Any thoughts on why Dickens has Pip misquote the Bible. It's from the Gospel according to Luke. There are two men who went into the temple, a Pharisee and a publican. A publican is a kind of tax collector, and the Pharisee prays and says, "Oh, I have been so devout in my life. I followed all the rules and been a devout believer." And the other man says, "Oh Lord, be merciful to me, a sinner." So it's two versions. One, perhaps overstated and hypocritical boasting about the reasons that the Pharisee, is deserving of divine favor, and the other, a humble man who does not boast but acknowledges his own sinfulness.
I think, John, that, and I've often thought about that scene. I think, in a way, Pip is talking about himself when he says, "Be merciful to him, a sinner," knowing very full well that the original version is "to me." And I think Dickens wants the reader to remember that version, the original version, which would apply to Pip. So it's there. That thought is there. It's as if Pip is praying for himself as well, I think.
Any other thoughts about that passage? I mean, your suggestion, Tom, is a charitable one, that Pip is including himself in that wish for mercy.
Yes.
Request for mercy, and that it refers back to him. A less charitable reading of the passage is that he excludes himself from the request for mercy and thinks only of the fact that Magwitch was a criminal. And now, in this moment of reconciliation, that Magwitch is the one who deserves mercy. Whereas Pip does not need mercy because Pip has not done anything that requires mercy. So there's a charitable and an uncharitable way of reading this. And this is another place where there's a crux in the text. And Pip's problem all along, particularly with respect to Joe, is that he does not see that he is being unkind and ungenerous to Joe because he's being selfish. But Pip as narrator, Pip looking back on his younger self and the actions taken by his younger self, knows full well that he has been unkind to Joe.
I think somebody could say that there's some arrogance in there, that, Pip needs that as well. I just kept thinking that he's trying to be as thoughtful and loving to Magwitch in his last moments. Magwitch at that moment didn't need to know that Estella, has a horrible heart, that she was raised, to act horribly towards men, to all those. He didn't need to know those things. And I think Pip is telling him what the more uplifting things that he should know about right now in his last moments.
The white lie is better than the cruel truth. It's not that Estella has a cruel heart, it's Estella has no heart.
In that context, I think it makes sense.
David, and then Glenna, and then Blair.
Going some distance back in our conversation, I want to comment on your remark, John, that the male-male relationships are important. It seems to me that they're the realistic ones, and the male-female relationships are much more fantasy. That's it.
And when you say the male-female, you're including Miss Havisham and the fairy godmother, the fairy tale version of the benefactor, and as well as the romantic fantasy, which is that the princess has been reserved for him and him alone. And the male-male relationships are the ones that are more grounded in.
Doesn't see the female characters with any real apprehension of their personalities.
Okay. A good observation. Glenna.
Okay, so I want to weigh in on a couple of things. I don't think that Pip is being ungenerous. I think when he says to him, because he's in a sense giving a dying man the last rites. There's no priest there, and he's easing him into death. And so he's not thinking about his own need for forgiveness. He's thinking about the fact that a man is dying, and these are the last rites he's going to get. And then about the withholding the truth, I don't think the truth is that Estella doesn't love him. I think the truth is Estella doesn't love. And I think Estella holds Pip in rather high esteem, high enough esteem that she knows herself she's incapable of love, at least at that point. Whether she is later is up for speculation, but she thinks she'll give herself to a lout like Drummle, because if she breaks his heart, it's no biggie. Whereas if she breaks Pip's heart, that is of consequence. Even in her worst moments, she knows that Pip is worth more than Drummle.
Yeah, I think that's true. Whether it's last rites, it certainly has a religious tonality and context for it. It's a moment of it's the moment of parting. It's the moment of farewell. It's the moment of death. And I keep thinking that this book is just remember where it starts. It starts in a graveyard with Pip looking at the gravestones of his parents and siblings. And everything in Pip's entire life comes from that moment. I mean, death shadows, to use that important word, this entire novel. Blair.
Okay, the parable that's quoted in Luke tends to fall into a category that Jesus told, in which the angels in heaven are more joyful at the repentance of a sinner than they are at the at the fake repentance of a saint. And I think that many people in Dickens' era knew their Bibles better than we do, and that people would not have been surprised to find that quote said at a deathbed scene. And my interpretation of what Pip says also, I wonder if Pip still had some hope for Estella. And if you keep that in mind, that brings a different interpretation of what he says at Magwitch's death. Okay. So Maybe the guy just still seems to be hoping right through to the second ending, that the second ending will happen. So I don't know. It's just my interpretation.
Clark, you're muted.
Now, this is fascinating. I just looking at it just this moment, are Estella and Pip actually talking past one another in the final exchange? Do they actually are they on the same page, or is Pip living in some kind of fantasy realm where he ignores what she says and insists that they will be together somehow, when in fact she says we'll be friends apart?
That's one way to read.
Yeah, I agree. I've wondered about that too. He seems to ignore her statement and just pull her up off the bench and walk away with her. And I thought, it seemed very contradictory to me that he was just going to grab her and carry her off.
David Lean thinks they walk out hand in hand, side by side, and you're suggesting that Pip is dragging her out.
No, I'm being a little bit deliberately humorous here.
I know.
But Clark's point is very well taken. He ignores her final statement.
I mean, he actually looms over her. He bends over her. That's a kind of a threatening posture, isn't it?
Yes. Well, I don't know, threatening, but certainly he's determined to have his way in that moment, I think.
I think that Dickens wanted, somebody else had said this, Dickens wanted, I think, some ambiguity at the end. He changed as Professor Jordan said, he changed the ending in the first one-volume edition of Great Expectations. He made the first change, and evidently, according to Professor Jordan, one of his other manuscripts had that. And why Shakespeare so great? Because I think it's open to interpretation, and perhaps that's what Dickens was after.
Dorothy has a hand up.
Yes, I loved the comments about the end of chapter 57. No, 56 as being last rites. I'm continuing with the Jesuitical idea of the mental reservation, that Pip knows what Joe feels about lies, and he hasn't really told a lie. He's done this wonderful mental reservation, kindness to Magwitch, and I think the merciful to him, a sinner, is his repentance for the kind of white lie. But Professor Jordan, I know this is terrible to go back, but you started out with a question about the letter. What did the letter look like? And it was dirty. And I wonder, why is the letter dirty? And he talks about the fact that he's got other friends now, 50 people, 50 different hands, many people who can write letters for him. And I wondered if you had any thoughts about that.
I don't have any deep thoughts about it. I think that Orlick is incapable of writing the letter that Pip receives. So the letter is composed and written by someone other than Orlick.
Yeah.
Based on information that Orlick has given to the other person. And I think the other person must be Compeyson, because Compeyson writes.
That's reasonable. But I wonder why it's dirty.
I think the letter is dirty because it's then given to Orlick to deliver. and Orlick gives it to somebody else, and somebody else. I don't know how the letter is delivered. That's a question we can't really answer. But I think the dirtiness of the letter is an effect of its transmission by hand.
One more question.
Yes, go ahead.
Why does only Mrs. Gargery, of all of Pip's siblings, the dead ones are all named, why do you think she has no name?
I think she does get a name late in the novel, and I think it's Georgiana.
Really?
Yes.
Okay.
Does somebody else remember?
Yeah, because Pete takes a little Pete to the graveyard, right? To show them the graveyard. Is this a correct scene that I remember?
I think it's, and there's also a middle name, Georgina something.
Yeah, Georgina, but he sees it
Georgina
on her
Maria.
grave. Yeah, Georgina Maria, right.
Okay, thank you.
Isn't she named after her mother?
It's also her mother. Yeah, it's also her mother. Georgina is also her mother. So
That's
she took Georgina for her mother.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's the answer, but it's not revealed until late in the novel, and I'm not remembering exactly where that occurs and who says it, but
Miss Havisham doesn't have a first name either.
Miss Havisham never gets a first name.
Yeah.
So, John, are you going to tell us your ending?
Well, I'll talk a little bit about it. The ending that I prefer, and here I'm being very, very literal in talking about the final sentence that Dickens worked and reworked. I agree that the original ending, the unhappy ending, where Pip and Estella do not end up as lovers or as fiancés or as people who will be together forever. I think that's more consistent with the sadness of this novel, which is, I think, a very sad novel. Sad, not tragic, but just a novel full of sadness, with complexity to its sadness. But I think this is a novel about separations and partings, and I keep thinking about that passage, which is one that we talked about, that when Joe comes to visit Pip in chapter 27 and says, life is made of ever so many partings welded together. And I think that this novel is made of ever so many partings welded together. The partings are both literal goodbyes. I mean, even in small ways, like Herbert leaving to go off to Egypt, and Pip then says that he feels that he has no home. So Estella in that last exchange says, and we'll continue friends apart. And that word apart is a version of that word that for me resonates through the entire novel, which is partings. That is both the pain of saying goodbye to someone whom you may not see again, or the pain of separation from someone at the moment of death or approaching death, or the moment when Joe remembers or thinks that Pip is still someone who needs to be called sir, and leaves him after nursing him back to health after his illness. that's another separation. That there are just so many separations, so many partings in this book. And so when I look at the last sentence, the two words that stand out for me are shadow and parting. And if I think the one that I prefer is I saw no shadow of another parting from her. And it has, for me, it means that he doesn't see the shadow. That even to the very end, that there's a way in which Pip is blind and wants to hope, just as, you know, in that other painful, difficult moment where he rehearses what he's going to say to Biddy when he proposes marriage to Biddy, and then gets back to the village and Biddy's no longer available because she's married Joe. There are things that Pip doesn't see clearly, and yes, there's moral development, moral growth in Pip, his friendship with Herbert, his loyalty to Magwitch, his appreciation of Joe, his recognition of his neglect of Joe. This novel is built around the rhythm of going back and forth between the village and the city. And every time that Pip goes back to the village and doesn't see Joe, it's painful because it's another parting. And so the sentence that I prefer of the possible endings is I saw no shadow of another parting, which has that ambiguity of Pip's hopefulness, but also perhaps his blindness. And for me, that same complexity is present in the Lord be merciful to him, a sinner, where Pip doesn't fully recognize, at least in my reading, the fact that he's the sinner who needs to be forgiven. Miss Havisham asks for forgiveness. Pip asks for forgiveness from Joe and Biddy, and that's to his credit. So it's not all one way or another. I don't want to read Pip skeptically and ironically and say he's just as self-deceived at the end of the book as he was earlier. It's part of the complexity, the psychological complexity and the moral complexity of this book, that ending remains a puzzle. What is the shadow? What is Pip's relationship to the shadow? When we talked about Molly and Pip's recognition of the kinship between Molly and Estella, that it was the shadow that kept coming back again and again. So is there some shadow, a shadow cast, not so much by Molly, her birth mother, but a shadow cast by Miss Havisham that lingers over Estella, even though she too has apparently grown and developed in her understanding of self and relationship. So anyway, that's the kind of reading that I favor about this book. And Kirk.
Yeah, and the fact that there can be multiple readings, I think, shows some of Dickens' genius. As you know, Professor, I'm more of a Shakespeare fan, and most people agree that Shakespeare was just a natural genius. He did not purposely layer in the 5-layer of subtexts that we can find in the various analyses in the Arden or the Oxford or the Cambridge Shakespeare or the Norton Shakespeare. What about Dickens? I think Dickens may be a genius in that sense because I don't believe although he spent a lot of time focusing on plot development, I don't think he was purposely putting in all these layers, but I bow to the wisdom of this great collection who, over the last 9 months, have again educated me so wonderfully in a book that I had really not paid any attention to before.
And like I said in my chat, I'm wondering what's left for the universe to come. But
Lots more. Lots.
Good question.
Thanks to everyone.
Tom Savignano, you have the last word.
I wanted to say something that struck me the other day that would bring together some of the themes. As a saying, going through fire and water to accomplish something. And it struck me that Pip has gone through fire with Havisham and has gone through water with Magwitch.
Mm.
And I just wondered if Dickens was, I suspect he wasn't thinking about that, but who knows? Maybe at the back of his mind, he really was going through fire and water.
So I'll comment just on one aspect of that, which is that there was a popular theatrical form that Dickens knew well because he wrote about it in the 19th century called the nautical melodrama. And I think that the conclusion to the escape is Dickens writing nautical melodrama. And I think it has a certain kinship with the shipwreck scene in David Copperfield, and that we should certainly think about that as having perhaps some kind of relationship to that other water ceremony of baptism and rebirth. Hey folks, it is time to end. So thank all of you for being here today. Thank you for your contributions. And there's no meeting next month. We will, I hope, see many of you this summer in Santa Cruz for the Dickens Universe. So thank you again to Wayne and the other discussion leaders. And I've really enjoyed this myself too.
Bravo.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, John.